Welcome. Today we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. War begins at sea. For American sailors, World War II did not begin on beaches or in cities. It began on water, endless, unstable, and unforgiving. The ocean offered no cover, no foxholes, and no pause. When the war came, it came suddenly, violently, and without warning. Sailors lived with the knowledge that if their ship went down, survival depended on minutes, not tactics. Before Pearl Harbor, many American sailors viewed service as routine duty. Long watches, drills, maintenance, and boredom defined daily life. Ships patrolled, trained, and waited. Few expected that the ocean itself would soon become one of the most lethal battlefields in history. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered that illusion. Ships burned at anchor. Men were trapped below decks. Explosions tore through steel hulls. Water rushed in faster than it could be contained. Sailors jumped into oil-covered water, while ammunition detonated around them. The war did not ask for preparation. It demanded immediate survival. From that moment on, American sailors understood that the sea offered no mercy. A hit below the waterline could doom a ship in minutes. Fire spread faster than men could run. Smoke blinded. Compartments flooded. Damage control became a matter of life and death. Sailors learned to fight not just the enemy, but their own ship's destruction. Life aboard ship was claustrophobic and relentless. Men slept in narrow bunks stacked inches apart. Ventilation was poor. Heat was constant in engine rooms and boiler spaces. The smell of fuel, sweat, and metal filled every space. Privacy did not exist. The ship became a world unto itself, isolated and vulnerable. Sailors trained constantly for disaster. Firefighting drills, flooding drills, abandoned ship drills. These were not formalities. They were rehearsals for moments when panic could kill faster than enemy fire. Every man had a station. Every task mattered. One failure could cascade into catastrophe. Combat at sea was sudden and absolute. Torpedoes struck without warning. Mines exploded beneath hulls. Aircraft attacked from the sky with little notice. Submarines waited unseen. Sailors rarely saw the enemy before destruction began. Survival depended on alertness and discipline at all times. Fear was constant, but controlled. Sailors learned to function with it present. Long hours on watch strained nerves. Nights were worse. Darkness hid threats. Every sound carried meaning, the hum of engines, the slap of waves, the alarm bell that could change everything instantly. When ships were hit, chaos followed. Damage control parties rushed into smoke and flame. Men sealed compartments knowing friends might be trapped inside. Decisions were brutal and immediate. Save the ship or save individuals? Often there was no time for both. Sailors trusted each other completely. Rank mattered less than competence in crisis. A seaman who could control flooding or fight fires was as valuable as any officer. Brotherhood formed quickly under shared danger. The ship's survival depended on collective effort. World War II at sea was not about heroics in the traditional sense. It was about endurance inside steel walls, facing an enemy that could strike invisibly and vanish. For American sailors, the ocean became a battlefield where mistakes were final and survival was never guaranteed. This was only the beginning. The war at sea would grow larger, deadlier, and more relentless than anything sailors had imagined. Convoys would burn, fleets would clash, entire crews would vanish beneath the waves, and the men aboard American ships would learn what it meant to fight where there was nowhere to hide. Convoys, U-boats, and the fear beneath the waves. For American sailors, one of the most terrifying fronts of World War II was invisible. It moved silently beneath the surface, striking without warning and disappearing just as quickly. The U-boat war turned the Atlantic into a killing ground where survival depended on vigilance, coordination, and luck. Sailors did not fear what they could see. They feared what they could not. Early in the war, American defenses were unprepared. Merchant ships sailed with minimal escort. Coastal cities kept lights on at night, silhouetting ships against the shoreline. German submarines exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. Torpedoes slammed into hulls. Ships broke apart. Men were thrown into freezing water, coated in oil and debris. Many never surfaced. Convoy duty became the backbone of survival. Merchant ships grouped together, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and patrol aircraft. The convoy was slow and predictable, but it was safer than sailing alone. Sailors stood watch for hours, scanning the horizon for periscopes, wakes, or oil slicks. Any anomaly triggered alarms. False sightings were common, but ignoring a real one could be fatal. Life aboard escort ships was exhausting. Sailors rotated through watches with little rest. Sonar operators listened constantly for faint echoes that might signal a submarine. Depth-charge crews stood ready to deploy weapons within seconds. When contact was made, everything happened fast. Engines roared as ships maneuvered. Depth charges rolled off rails, detonating underwater with violent force that shook hulls and bones alike. Yet success was uncertain. Many attacks ended with nothing confirmed. Submarines slipped away silently. Sailors knew that failing to destroy a U-boat meant it could return to strike again. The tension of unfinished fights wore heavily on crews. When a convoy was hit, chaos followed. Escorts broke formation to rescue survivors while maintaining defense. Sailors pulled men from the water, many suffering from hypothermia, burns, or shock. Some clung to wreckage for hours. Others disappeared before help arrived. Rescues were dangerous. Stopping made ships vulnerable to further attack. Weather added another layer of danger. Storms scattered convoys, reduced visibility, and complicated sonar detection. Ice formed on decks and equipment. In heavy seas, launching depth charges or recovering survivors became nearly impossible. Sailors fought both enemy and environment, often simultaneously. Gradually, American tactics improved. Blackouts were enforced along coastlines. Convoy systems expanded. New technologies, better sonar, radar, and escort carriers, shifted the balance. Sailors learned to coordinate attacks, box submarines in, and maintain pressure until contact was lost or a kill confirmed. But fear never disappeared. Every sailor understood that a single torpedo could end everything instantly. There were no foxholes at sea. There was only steel, water, and seconds to react. Convoy duty rarely made headlines. It lacked dramatic battles or visible victories. Yet it was decisive. Without convoys, troops, equipment, and fuel would never reach the front. The war could not be fought, let alone won, without these slow, dangerous crossings. For sailors, the Atlantic War was a test of nerves as much as skill. They learned patience, discipline, and trust in procedures designed to keep them alive against an enemy that hunted silently below. And as the war expanded, the sea would demand even more. The Atlantic was only one front. The Pacific awaited, with battles that would dwarf anything sailors had yet seen. Carrier warfare and the battle for control of the sea. As the war expanded beyond convoys and coastal patrols, American sailors entered a new kind of naval conflict: carrier warfare. Control of the sea would no longer be decided primarily by battleships exchanging gunfire at visual range. It would be decided by aircraft launched from floating airfields, often hundreds of miles apart. For the sailors who served aboard these ships, the ocean became a chessboard where a single mistake could doom thousands. Life on an aircraft carrier was constant motion and constant tension. Flight decks were never truly quiet. Aircraft were launched and recovered from dawn until night, sometimes longer. Sailors worked inches from spinning propellers, jetting exhaust, and rolling aircraft. One misstep could send a man overboard or into machinery. Accidents were common and often fatal, even without enemy action. Every sailor had a role in keeping the carrier alive. Deck crews moved aircraft quickly to clear landing areas. Ordnance crews armed bombs and torpedoes under extreme pressure. Engine room sailors kept turbines running at full speed for days at a time. Damage control teams drilled endlessly, knowing that when a carrier was hit, survival depended on seconds. Combat at sea came suddenly. Enemy aircraft appeared on radar as blips, then as distant specks, then as screaming shapes diving toward the fleet. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire in overlapping barrages. The sky filled with tracer rounds and exploding shells. Sailors watched aircraft burst into flame or continue diving despite being hit. When bombs struck, decks buckled, fires erupted, and smoke filled passageways. Damage control became the difference between life and death. Sailors rushed into burning compartments, carrying hoses, axes, and pumps. They sealed flooded sections, often knowing that friends might be trapped inside. Fires had to be contained immediately, or they would reach fuel lines and ammunition stores. The ship either survived as a unit or died as one. Carrier battles such as Midway and later engagements in the Pacific changed everything. Sailors learned that victory often came from striking first and striking accurately. A single successful attack could cripple or sink a carrier. Likewise, a single failure in defense could doom an entire task force. The margin for error was razor thin. Sailors lived with exhaustion as a constant. Sleep came in short bursts between alarms. Meals were missed. Clothing stayed damp with sweat and seawater. The ship rolled and vibrated endlessly. There was no escape from the environment. The carrier was home, workplace, and battlefield combined. Fear took a different shape at sea. There was no cover to run to. When the alarm sounded, sailors moved toward danger, not away from it. Fires, flooding, and explosions were fought head-on. Courage meant standing in place, doing your job while the ship shook beneath you. The human cost was severe. Entire crews vanished when ships were sunk. Survivors floated for hours or days before rescue, exposed to sun, dehydration, and sharks. Sailors who survived these ordeals carried the memory forever. The sea did not mark graves. As American carrier forces grew stronger, tactics improved. Task forces layered defenses, radar warning, fighter interception, anti-aircraft fire, and damage control readiness. Coordination between ships increased. Sailors learned to trust the system as much as individual skill. The fleet became a single organism, reacting to threats with practiced precision. carrier warfare shifted the balance of the Pacific War decisively. As Japanese naval aviation was destroyed, American sailors gained freedom of movement across vast distances. Amphibious landings, supply routes, and strategic strikes became possible only because the carriers held the sea. For sailors, this was not abstract strategy. It was lived reality. Every launch, every recovery, every alarm reinforced the understanding that control of the sea meant survival, for themselves and for everyone fighting beyond the horizon. And yet, carriers were only one part of the naval war. Beneath the surface, another silent struggle continued, one that would test sailors' nerves to the breaking point. Submarines, the silent service, and war below, the surface. For American sailors, no part of the naval war was more isolated or more psychologically demanding than service aboard submarines. Known quietly as the Silent Service, U.S. submarines operated far from fleets and convoys, alone for weeks at a time, hunting an enemy that rarely revealed itself. Down here, there were no dramatic broadsides or cheering crowds. There was patience, tension, and the constant awareness that a single mistake could end everything. Life aboard a submarine was claustrophobic beyond imagination. Space was measured in inches. Men slept wherever there was room, between torpedoes, beneath pipes, beside machinery. Air was stale, thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and oil. Fresh water was rationed. Showers were rare or non-existent. Days blended together without sunlight. The boat became a sealed world, cut off from everything but orders and the enemy. Submarine warfare demanded discipline and restraint. Crews learned to move quietly, to avoid unnecessary noise that could be picked up by enemy sonar. Conversations were hushed. Tools were padded. Footsteps were careful. Silence was not just a tactic. It was survival. When a submarine was detected, it became prey. Combat underwater was nerve-wracking. An attack began with hours of tracking, plotting, and waiting. Periscopes rose briefly, offering seconds of observation. Torpedoes were loaded and set. When they were fired, the boat often turned away immediately, diving deeper to evade detection. Then came the wait. If the attack was successful, explosions echoed faintly through the hull. If not, enemy escorts responded with depth charges, explosions designed to crush a submarine with pressure. The sound was overwhelming. The boat shook violently. Lights flickered. Gauges rattled. Men held their breath as hull plates groaned. Each explosion might be the one that split the pressure hull open. Damage control underwater was a nightmare. Flooding had to be sealed instantly. Electrical fires were deadly in enclosed spaces. Crews trained obsessively for these scenarios, moving in darkness, sealing compartments, shoring bulkheads, and restoring power, while the boat creaked around them. American submarines faced early challenges. Torpedoes malfunctioned, detonators failed, targets escaped. Frustration grew as risks increased without results, but persistence paid off. As technical problems were corrected and tactics refined, U.S. submarines became devastatingly effective. In the Pacific, submarines strangled Japanese supply lines. They sank cargo ships, tankers, and warships, cutting off fuel, food, and reinforcements. The impact was cumulative and catastrophic. Japanese garrisons starved. Industry slowed. Naval operations became impossible without fuel. Submarines did not win battles in a single day. They won the war by denying the enemy the ability to fight. The psychological toll on submarine sailors was immense. Patrols lasted weeks or months. Contact with home was non-existent. Fear was constant, but invisible. There was no release, no chance to step away from danger. Many sailors later said submarine duty aged them years in months. Yet camaraderie was intense. Crews depended on each other absolutely. There was no hierarchy in survival. Every man mattered. Trust was total. Jokes were dark and infrequent, but they mattered. In the silence, small rituals, meals, maintenance routines, shared stories, kept sanity intact. Losses were heavy. When a submarine failed to return, there were often no survivors and no answers. Boats vanished without a trace. Crews were remembered only by patrol reports that ended abruptly. The sea kept its secrets. Despite this, the silent service pressed on. They operated without glory, without recognition, and often without public understanding of their impact. But their effect was decisive. By the end of the war, American submarines had crippled Japan's economy and navy. For the sailors who served below the surface, the war was not loud or visible. It was measured in tension held for hours, in breaths taken quietly, and in survival achieved without witnesses. The silent service fought a war few ever saw, and it changed the course of the Pacific forever. Kamikazes, damage control, and fighting to keep ships afloat. By 1944, American sailors faced a threat that changed the psychology of naval warfare completely. Japan, running out of experienced pilots, fuel, and ships, turned to a tactic built not on survival, but on sacrifice. Kamikaze attacks transformed the sea into a place where even a single aircraft could become a weapon of mass destruction. For sailors aboard American ships, the battle was no longer only about shooting down the enemy. It was about keeping their ship alive after impact. Kamikaze attacks came without hesitation. Pilots did not break off. They did not evade. They aimed directly at ships, often choosing the most vulnerable targets: carriers, destroyers, and troop transports. Even when hit by anti-aircraft fire, many continued diving, engines screaming, trailing smoke and flame. Sailors watched aircraft disintegrate in midair or slam into decks with catastrophic force. When a kamikaze hit, the first seconds were chaos. Fuel exploded. Fires spread instantly. Shrapnel tore through decks and passageways. Men were thrown across compartments. The ship's structure itself became a threat, with twisted metal and collapsing bulkheads. In those moments, survival depended entirely on damage control. Damage control parties were trained for exactly this scenario. Sailors grabbed hoses, axes, pumps, and firefighting gear and moved toward the flames. There was no time to assess fear. Fires had to be contained before they reached fuel tanks or ammunition magazines. Flooded compartments had to be sealed, even if it meant trapping wounded or dead inside. These decisions were brutal but necessary. A single unchecked fire could sink a ship. Sailors fought fires and smoke so thick they could not see their hands. Breathing became painful. Protective gear was limited. Heat was intense enough to blister skin. Men passed out and were dragged away, replaced instantly by others. There was no heroism in these moments, only urgency and repetition drilled through endless training. Medical response happened simultaneously. Corpsmen treated burns, shrapnel wounds, and shock wherever space allowed. Passageways became triage points. Decks were cleared of debris and bodies as quickly as possible, not out of disregard, but because clutter slowed survival. Sailors learned to step over wreckage and fallen comrades to keep moving. Anti-aircraft crews continued firing even as damage control teams worked. The threat did not end with one impact. Kamikaze attacks often came in waves. Ships already burning had to defend themselves while fighting internal destruction. Coordination under these conditions demanded extraordinary discipline. Destroyers and smaller ships faced especially high risk. Their lighter armor meant a single hit could cripple propulsion or power. Yet these ships often stayed in formation, continuing to screen carriers and transports despite damage. Sailors understood that abandoning position could expose others to attack. The psychological toll was severe. Kamikazes removed the expectation that skill or superiority guaranteed survival. Sailors knew that even perfect defense could fail if one aircraft slipped through. This uncertainty wore on nerves. Sleep was shallow. Alarms triggered instant adrenaline. Men lived in a constant state of readiness, knowing the next attack could come at any moment. Despite this, American sailors adapted. Defensive tactics improved. Radar detection became more effective. Fighter interception increased. Anti-aircraft coordination tightened. Damage control techniques evolved rapidly as lessons were learned from each hit. Survival rates improved, not because attacks stopped, but because sailors became better at fighting their own ship's destruction. Kamikaze warfare revealed a harsh truth. Naval combat was no longer just about defeating the enemy. It was about enduring impact, absorbing damage, and continuing to operate despite wounds that would have sunk ships in earlier wars. For American sailors, courage was not charging the enemy. It was standing in smoke and fire, hands blistering on hoses and steel, knowing that if they stopped, the sea would take everything. And even as the attacks intensified, sailors held the line. Because if the ships held, the war could continue. Life after impact, exhaustion, loss, and endurance at sea. After a ship survived a kamikaze strike or torpedo hit, the battle did not end. For American sailors, survival marked the beginning of another phase, endurance after impact. Ships that remained afloat were often damaged, understaffed, and exhausted, yet expected to stay in action. There was no pause to process loss. The ocean demanded immediate readiness. Damage control became routine rather than emergency. Burned compartments were sealed and bypassed. Temporary repairs were made with steel plates, timber, and anything available. Electrical systems were rerouted. Pumps ran constantly to control flooding. Sailors slept near their stations, ready to respond at the first alarm. Rest came in minutes, not hours. Loss was ever present. Sailors counted who was missing after each incident. Some bodies were never recovered, lost to fire or sea. Others were wrapped in canvas and committed to the ocean in brief ceremonies conducted while the ship continued moving. There was little time for mourning. The ship's survival required focus, and grief had to wait. Crew cohesion deepened under these conditions. Men relied on each other absolutely. Roles blurred as sailors stepped into tasks outside their training. Engineers helped fight fires. Deck crews assisted medics. Cooks carried ammunition. Rank mattered less than capability. Whoever could do the job did it. Exhaustion accumulated quickly. Continuous operations, constant alerts, and the stress of repeated attacks drained physical and mental reserves. Sailors functioned on habit and drill. Mistakes increased as fatigue grew, making discipline even more critical. Leaders watched for signs of collapse and rotated men whenever possible, though options were limited. Medical care aboard ship faced unique challenges. Burns, smoke inhalation, and shrapnel wounds were common. Corpsmen worked in cramped, damaged spaces with limited supplies. Evacuation was often delayed until the ship could reach safer waters. Treating the wounded while the ship maneuvered under threat required calm under chaos. Despite damage and loss, ships returned to duty quickly. Repairs at forward bases were rushed. Crews replenished ammunition and fuel, then rejoined the fleet. The expectation was clear: stay in the fight. Sailors understood that their endurance enabled operations ashore and protected other ships. The psychological impact lingered. Sailors replayed moments of impact, the sound of the hit, the rush of heat, the screams in smoke-filled corridors. Sleep was light and restless, yet camaraderie offered stability. Shared meals, jokes, and routines grounded men in something normal amid destruction. As the war neared its end, attacks continued. Kamikazes did not stop simply because defeat loomed. Sailors remained vigilant, knowing that the last strike could be the most dangerous. Experience taught them never to assume safety. Endurance at sea was not heroic in a cinematic sense. It was repetitive, draining, and unforgiving. It meant doing the same dangerous tasks again and again, even when strength was gone. It meant accepting loss without being consumed by it. American sailors endured because the fleet endured, and because the fleet endured, the war could be brought to a close. One chapter remains: what happened when the sea finally grew quiet, and what these sailors carried home. The end of the war and the quiet that followed. When the war finally ended at sea, it did not end with celebration aboard most American ships. It ended with a quiet that felt unfamiliar and unsettling. For sailors who had lived with constant alarms, watch rotations, and the expectation of sudden death, silence carried its own weight. The ocean looked the same, but everything else had changed. News of surrender spread through fleets unevenly. Some crews heard it over radios during routine watches. Others learned when officers gathered them on deck and spoke words few had expected to hear so soon. Reactions varied. Relief came first, deep and physical. Men sat down where they stood. Some laughed. Others stared at the horizon, processing the idea that the danger they had lived with every day was finally over. Ships remained at sea. There were no immediate returns home. Duties continued, escorting convoys, guarding surrendered vessels, supporting occupation forces, and transporting prisoners. Sailors adjusted slowly, maintaining routines out of habit. Damage control drills continued. Watches were stood. Weapons remained manned. Experience had taught them not to relax too quickly. The emotional toll surfaced in this quiet. Memories that had been pushed aside during combat returned uninvited. Sailors remembered ships that had not survived, compartments that had filled with smoke and fire, friends lost to the sea without graves. The ocean, once an enemy, became a reminder of absence. Burials at sea continued even after fighting stopped. Wounded men succumbed to injuries days later. Ceremonies were brief and solemn. The ship slowed. Words were spoken. Bodies were committed to the water. Then engines resumed their steady rhythm. Life aboard ship moved forward because it had to. Demobilization was slow. Sailors waited months before returning home. Some were reassigned to different ships or duties. Crews that had survived together were separated by orders and schedules. Goodbyes were short and practical. Men shook hands, exchanged addresses, and promised to write, promises many would never keep, not from lack of care, but from the difficulty of bridging what they had shared. When ships finally returned to ports, the contrast was overwhelming. Civilians cheered, bands played, families waved. Sailors stepped onto land that felt strangely unstable after years at sea. Noise felt different. Space felt open. Many struggled to adjust to life without constant structure and threat. For some, the sea never left them. Sounds triggered memories. The smell of fuel or salt air brought moments back instantly. Others found peace in routine, work, and family life. The discipline learned aboard ship translated into stability ashore, even as memories remained. The war at sea had demanded endurance rather than glory. Sailors had survived torpedoes, bombs, fire, and exhaustion. They had watched ships burn and disappear. They had kept going because stopping was not an option. Now, with the ocean quiet and orders changed, they faced a different challenge, living in a world that no longer required them to be constantly ready to die. One chapter remains: what this war at sea meant and why the sailors who fought it mattered long after the guns fell silent. Legacy of the American Sailor. The legacy of the American sailor in World War II is written not in single decisive moments, but in endurance sustained over years of constant danger. Sailors fought a war where there were no front lines, no safe rear areas, and no pause once the ship left port. The ocean did not forgive mistakes, and neither did the enemy. Survival depended on discipline, coordination, and the willingness to keep functioning when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm everything. The first legacy was collective survival. At sea, no one survived alone. A ship lived or died as a unit. Damage control, navigation, weapons, engineering, and medical response were inseparable. Every sailor's task mattered, regardless of rank. This understanding reshaped naval culture, reinforcing the idea that teamwork was not an abstract value, but the difference between floating and sinking. The second legacy was technical mastery under pressure. American sailors became experts in their systems because failure was immediate and final. Engines had to run, pumps had to work, guns had to fire. Repairs were made in smoke-filled compartments, under rolling decks, and with limited tools. This technical competence, forged in combat, became a foundation of post-war naval dominance. The third legacy was emotional resilience. Sailors lived with constant uncertainty, torpedoes without warning, aircraft diving from the sky, fires spreading through steel corridors. They learned to suppress fear, not eliminate it. This resilience was not glamorous. It was quiet, repetitive, and exhausting. It allowed sailors to stand watch night after night, knowing the next alarm could be their last. The fourth legacy was adaptation. Early failures in convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare forced rapid change. Sailors learned new tactics, adopted new technologies, and integrated air, surface, and submarine forces into a coordinated system. This adaptability turned. World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.